Wishing you all a very happy Navratri, as we've been talking about, and Durga Puja, because I'm a Bengali. So, welcome to another exciting series of talks on entrepreneurship, the many tools that an entrepreneur needs in this journey. Today, we are going to talk about funding. I am Sharmila Pandey, founder of Step Up Parenting and Wellbeing, a safe space where we handhold parents during their lifelong parenting journey, where we talk about holistic parenting, support systems, back to work, children, developmental milestones, do's and don'ts. I'm also the chairperson of the Mumbai Mentoring Cell, where we are helping each other, connecting mentees to mentors on a one-on-one basis over the next 6 months, a give and take relationship, a sounding board for questions that you wanted to ask, wanted the answers, but didn't know who to ask. This is a national level initiative of Wikiflow. And for this, we have partnered with Startup Caravan to invite experts in various fields to come and share their journey, share their tips, learnings, pitfalls, accelerators. You need to know all of them to be a successful entrepreneur. So this week, we have with us two accomplished women running their own businesses to share their journeys. One, Sari Chahal, a serial entrepreneur, and one, Archana Khosla Burman, who helps other entrepreneurs raise funds. So, welcome, both of you. We all know that money makes the world go round. So, every business, actually, every person needs money to survive in this world. So the question on every entrepreneur's mind is, I have an idea. Now, how do I get the money to get it off the ground? Convert this idea, this brilliant idea that I have, into a viable business. Who will give us money? What is the process? When do we raise money from investors? What are the pros and cons of raising different sorts of funding at different life stages? So first, we have Sari. Sari Chahal is the founder CEO of Sheroes. It's the world's largest online ecosystem for women. Sheroes helps women get more from life, from careers, jobs to health, family, life, and well-being. They have a Sheroes app. They have Baby Gogo, a platform to support young mothers. Maya, a global reproductive health platform, and a remote work product called Mars. They have a global footprint of 16 million women on their network. Superb. Sari has a MPhil from JNU and a PGDBM from IMT Ghaziabad. She's a fellow of the Ananta Aspen Kamal Nayan Bajaj Fellowship and a member of the Aspen Global Network. She's on the board of Paytm Payments Bank. In her journey, she has won many awards, the Devi Award, the Femina Achievers Award, Editor's Choice for L'Oreal, Most Powerful Women, just to name a few. Over the years, Sheroes has acquired companies like Maya, Baby Gogo, Women Restart, and raised $2.6 million plus from various investors. So it would be great to hear from you, Sari, about how your funding journey has been.
Absolutely.
With her, hi, Sari. With her, we have Archana Khosla Burman, founder partner of Vertices Partners. She specializes in corporate commercial law, venture capital, private equity investments with expertise in mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, strategic acquisitions over multiple sectors. He again has featured in 40 Under 40 in Asia Pacific region and 40 Under 40 Rising Star by Legal Era. She was awarded the Entrepreneur of the Year 2019 by Indian Women Convention. Archana is also a speaker and writer on several forums like ET Now, Bloomberg, and Venture Intelligence. She has also mentored and advised many budding and seasoned entrepreneurs and sits on advisory boards of these ventures. She is also a member of many POSH committees and an active member of FICCI, Women's Indian Chamber of Commerce, ICC. She, by the way, is also the spearhead of this startup caravan that engages new and aspiring entrepreneurs at the grassroots levels. So welcome, Archana, and happy to see you on the other side today, sharing your expertise with us. So today I have with me Pooja Raisurana, another fellow entrepreneur and part of the Mumbai Mentoring Cell. Pooja is an interior designer and a creative consultant. A very warm welcome to all of you all and to all the others who've taken their time out to come and hear these super women and learn from these experiences. So over to you, Sari and Archana.
Thank you so much, Sharmila, for such a warm and detailed introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be on this side today, as Sharmila said, and to have a fireside chat with Sari, who's a stalwart entrepreneur, a dear friend, a client, and a wonderful person. She's a trailblazer herself. And I'm very excited today to be having this chat with her to discuss on such a relevant and sought after topic around capital raise, fundraise. This is something which often gets asked by most of the entrepreneurs. So I think first and foremost, we all need to understand that raising money is a journey and not an event. I think a lot of times we feel that, okay, when is it going to happen? But we have to think of it like a process, it's a journey, and eventually it reaches that. For every entrepreneur, the fears that cripple them even before day one are as it is manifold. There are challenges in every single way we can imagine. And to top it all, we have the fear of the how, what, and when around fundraise. So I think to begin with, the decision of whether a fundraise is required at all or not is a very strategic one. And for every business, the right time to raise capital will be as unique to them as their business plan and the products they offer. So there's no cookie cutter approach, or there's no situation like every venture has to raise capital. It's very bespoke. Raising cash is a significant part of an entrepreneur's endeavors. And for better or worse, it's also a considerable challenge. Like, not every startup, as I said, needs to raise funding. We know many successful startups who have bootstrapped to create growth with little or no external capital as well, especially for the lucky few who are cash flow positive from day one itself. So there are enough and more small businesses which are very successful, profitable, satisfying, and small by design. However, if your passion is to dominate the industry, scalability is the only way, which requires capital. So I think when you're thinking of raising capital, the first and foremost you have to look at is it depends upon the stage of your venture and the kind of capital you're seeking. For example, for seed capital, it would be important that there is a minimum viable product which you have been able to create. Importantly, this doesn't necessarily always have to be a working prototype, but it must demonstrate that you have refined your idea and show how it solves the problem for other people. The second important element would be that a level of customer traction is proven. You have a demonstrable and repeatable formula for retaining customers, and real customers and not your aunt or neighbor. A user base that are paying customers is desired and is something which is looked at by investors typically. Second is, if you're looking at not seed capital but growth capital, is when you have reached the product market fit. You have built out your acquisition channels. So more capital is required to grow as a business and reach more of your already identified customers. Now, subsequent rounds, when we talk about the series C, D onwards, occur once your business has exceptional traction, is an established company in the space. You're looking to either expand into a new market, it could be international regions, product space, these are common reasons, or you wanted to fight off competitors that are catching up. But I think one thing common, we all need to appreciate and understand that investors, whether in the form of friends and family or high net worth individuals or venture capitalists, deploy large amounts of capital and undoubtedly expect significant returns. Hence, the process of raising money from these investors is far from trivial. And therefore, it becomes that much more significant for founders to understand the nuances of capital raise. And I think with that thought, Sari, given that you are a seasoned entrepreneur, have raised capital over the years, multiple rounds, what is your perspective around fundraise? And since we have a lot of young entrepreneurs listening to us, and we have a bunch of students actually with us today who are aspiring to be entrepreneurs, I think everyone would love to hear your story on what were the determining factors for you to consider a fundraise the first time around or the second time around. Was there, how did you go about it? Was there a process or a checklist of sorts which, entrepreneurs can look at?
Right. So thank you, Archana, and thank you, Vicky Flo, for having me here. So look, fundraise, I know sounds really exciting, and it looks like we will go ask for money and people will give us money. It does happen, and look, I think as a company we've raised almost now $7 million in all, and what we realize is, uh, I think all businesses have to fall under two brackets. One is what I call investable businesses. And when I say investable, I mean venture investable. So I think before we understand fundraising, we need to understand this source of capital, which is the venture capital that we are talking about, or at least some, even if it's angel capital, it's still venture capital in a asset class. And I think capital works in different ways. All capital wants returns, and I think venture wants disproportionate returns. So I think the only time you should really raise venture capital is when you're ready to give uh, disproportionate returns back to your investors. So just to give you a very small example, before I started Shiro's and started raising venture capital, I ran a consulting company for 5 years. We were a small boutique business. We were profitable from day one. We were a small team, but the business fundamentally was not scalable. It was not a business that could have grown 10x even with an infusion of capital, right? And that business, if I had to raise money in that business, I would go to a bank and I would take a term loan, or I would take a debt instead of equity, and I would return that on a market rate over a period of time. But when I look at an internet company, we know that we are fundamentally building an asset that has a high degree of growth velocity, which means that it can go from 0 to 100 like in a very short span of time. Shiro's has gone from 0 to 21 million users in about 4 to 5 years in all its existence. And that's the kind of growth that venture as an asset class wants. So when you think of yourself as a founder who's raising money, ask yourself, will this business make 100 rupees for every $1 that is invested? And if the answer is no, then do not go to a venture capitalist, because it is going to be hard. And I think, look, when we raise capital, this is not capital that we're going to keep with us for the rest of our life. This is a capital that needs to be returned within a significant period of time, whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 8 years or whatever that time period is. This is an asset class that needs to sort of multiply itself, create returns for everyone in the chain, yourself, your investors, their LPs, and then sort of become something really, really valuable. So fundamentally look at the nature of your business. And a lot of businesses are great and profitable, but they're not venture investable. Any business that cannot grow, let's say 10x in a period of 5 years, is clearly sort of not venture investable. There are some certain exceptions like consumer brands. So that's the fundamental thing. How did we do this? So clearly, when I ran my consulting company, I didn't raise a single paisa from outside, and I knew that we have to be on our own. And we did take bank loans and we did other forms of capital. But here I am starting a consumer internet company at a time, this is around 2014, 2015. This is just when Flipkart had started. Paytm was still in test phase. So it was a very different era of Indian internet. And we have obviously seen this growth happen in last 5, 6 years. This is pre-Geo, pre-WhatsApp. Facebook was still a smaller company. And obviously, the assumption when I raised my first round of capital was that internet in India is going to grow, and it can be a valuable proposition to build a platform for women in India, and that was a fundamental assumption, right? So if I trace my footsteps back, that fundamental assumption has held true, right? So the business has seen almost 20x growth in a period of 5 years. So every 1 rupee that was invested, maybe back in 2015, is now hopefully at least 20 rupees, if not 100 rupees. So that's the nature of the asset class, and I think one should always do this maths to yourself to say, what kind of business am I creating? Will it go out and become a large business? And then of course there are levels of fundraising. So my first round was just $600K from mostly angel investors, and since then we've done other institutional rounds and stuff. So clearly, I think, and there are many paths to this game. I think within institutional, there are like a lot of things to learn. But if your business is investable, then obviously there is a playbook, and I'm happy to share more.
Right. And Sari, just also, if you have to tell them how do you reach out to the investor? That you're a part of if you're a part of a network, you automatically that happens. So entrepreneurs keep asking us, how do we go about it? So is
Right.
there a pattern which anybody needs to follow?
Right. So look, I think for every investable business that is raising money, there are 100 others competing, right? So it's the same number of dollars that everybody's competing for, uh, and I think it's important as founders that you are your best salesperson, honestly. So when raising money, apply the rules of sales. Look at your funnel. So it's actually really, really simple. Your top of the funnel needs to be massive. Think 100 investors, and if you want to like close with 2 to 3 in the by the time you're really at a term sheet stage or signing stage, then it clearly needs to sort of have that much of room, right? So it's and also because uh, not every investor is fit for your business. You're not fit for every investor. So looking for that, it's almost like getting married. You really have to meet a lot of people to find that right fit. Sometimes it works out nicely, sometimes it works like in spur of the moment, but you can't leave luck to chance, right? You can't leave these things to chance. So there is a science behind it, there is a method to this madness. And the fundamental thing is, I think as founders, it's our job to reach out to investors. And before we reach out to investors, we do all our homework. We make sure we have worked on our decks, we have tested our idea, our demo is working, our business plan is really foolproof, we know all our numbers, we know what's our work plan. So I think that homework is a given before you go to an investor, but also going to the right kind of investor. So if you're raising a seed round, there's no point going to a private equity investor, because their mandate is to write larger checks. Or if you are a consumer business, then there's no point going to an investor who only invests in technology businesses. Uh, or if you are a agri-tech company, then there's no point going to somebody who only does consumer. So I think the idea is to go to the right investor to begin with. And of course, uh, look, it's a lot of hustle. It's a lot of hustle. The truth is, as founders, there are many of us, and as investors, it's a very small group. So there will always be lesser investors and more people wanting their money, and that means it's our job to sell our business. Okay, when I raised my angel round, honestly, I knew people I wanted money from at least 5 years before that. So and honestly, even with that, raising money is never easy. It's never easy for anyone. So to sort of not put in the prep work is setting up for failure. So it's very, very important to sort of one, build your relationships much before you really need them. And I keep saying this to everyone, all founders, that go out and build your relationships as much as possible. uh, and of course, go talk to other founders who've raised money, because there are small nuances. Founders are also very closely knit as a community, which means their reference. So if somebody has invested in me and I refer another founder to say, hey, why don't you look at this person? She's also raising. It just makes for a better, uptake for your case here, as opposed to cold calling. So always look for a reference. Always, do your demo with somebody who will sort of give you feedback before you go and, make a presentation. But more than that, I think building your relationships way ahead, really like the most optimal thing to do. And it's never too late to start today, honestly.
Absolutely. In fact, what you just touched upon is something which entrepreneurs want us to tell them in terms of what is it that we need to do? How do we know that we are prepared for fundraising? How to plan the fundraising process? And I thought we'd take this opportunity to kind of, talk about some of the key elements. So the first and foremost is the pitch deck and business plan, which you need to have ready. Like Sari said, you have to prepare much before time. And as I said as well, that it's a journey and not an event. So you have to prepare. So when I talk about pitch deck and business plan, you have to highlight the most important aspects of your business. Your pitch deck should include information on your company, the team, the competition, the target market, the milestones, future plans, funding requirements. Basically, you have to think through everything. Your pitch deck has to establish a compelling narrative about your company's vision and plans, and details as to what makes your startup different from the others, or what will make it thrive. So I think those elements are very important. The second aspect as well, which Sari briefly touched on, is the investor research. While there is, wide variety and types of investors, which will go from individuals to HNIs to institutional investors to family offices, you have to know what stage you're at. Some investors would be very focused on certain specific sectors, so your research has to be done. And you will see that they all have at least one thing in common. They're looking for investment opportunities in businesses that offer the potential of significant returns. So different types of investors may be specialized in different stages and funding rounds. Understanding those differences is very important and critical for us when we are looking at this as well. Third important element I can think of is, what is the type of capital you need? You need to do that groundwork, decide, are you looking at debt or are you looking at equity? What is the type of capital you need? So accordingly, you can approach the relevant investors for those. Fourth, I can think of is market research. You have to ensure that you have a comprehensive understanding of your customers, your target market, your competitors. Building a strong team to take yourself out of the critical path is also something which investors appreciate. Because if you're still spending most of your time working in your business rather than on your business, then you're not ready to scale. You have to be able to show that you can continue to hire the right set of people to run the scaled business without you being everywhere and making every decision. The other important element is also about outsourcing what is non-strategic so that you can optimize leverage. Now, there are entrepreneurs who never outsource their core competency and never rely on intellectual property which they don't own. They also don't try to do everything in-house, since growing all the expertise you need is slow and it can expensive as well. So I think scaling requires leveraging outside resources as well. And these are some of the key elements, of course, apart from a lot of legal aspects, which I can tell you separately as a lawyer, the things you need to take care of. You have to get the vendor due diligence done. You have to be in compliance with applicable laws, because you have to understand that the moment there is a term sheet on the table, there is going to be a diligence which is going to get conducted on your company, and that can tantamount to a deal breaker if things are not in order. So your house has to be in order. So there are a lot of elements pertaining to that as well. But when we specifically, Sari, talk about women entrepreneurs, since this is a forum for women, and you are also so much, your business is primarily on empowering women. We women entrepreneurs, in addition to all these, often have to face another set of challenges as well. So do you think, in your experience or in the experience of your other women in your community, does gender really matter to investors?
Well, I think gender is a construct that can't be taken out from our lives, right? So I think so gender is really something that stays with us in every aspect of our life. And I think being women, we know there are some invisible universal barriers. Nobody says you're a woman, you can't do this, but the truth is there are some assumptions they already have. And it can be many. It can be, so I'll give you some personal examples. So I'm a single founder, so investors want a lot of they like co-founders, they like other people on the team, or the fact that you may not come from a technology background, or the fact that you might be older than the rest, because the average entrepreneur is a 22-year-old guy from IIT with three other co-founders. So you may not sort of fit that bill. The other sort of thing that's kind of important to know is, look, investing is a business of trust, and we trust people we know, we hang out with. So what happens is now, because of the nature of the industry, most investors are men. So, there are very few. I think India has barely like, 3, 4 women who are writing checks. And obviously the amount of capital they're writing is still not large enough. And so what it does is that the decision makers are all men, right? And they're obviously very comfortable with, men they went to college with, men they went to work with at Goldman Sachs, men they know from workplace. So a lot of us who are women are, we are not being actively discriminated against, but the fact is we have a much lower chance because we are not hangout buddies with the VCs, right? We will never have a chance to, go out and have an easy drink and say, look what a cool founder I am and I'm building such a great company and talk to me. But really the odds are down low. And I think as women, uh, so it becomes even more important for us to demonstrate how awesome we are and what great companies we can build, or we're building a great product. So I always say this, the biggest job we have here is to sort of go out and put our work out there. Nobody's going to come to our doors knocking to say, tell us who you are and how cool you are. It's our job to go out and demonstrate everything we're building. So whether it means showing up for events, or whether it means sort of actively pitching, whether it means putting our hand up, because as women, I think by virtue of our own positioning in in the society, in our lives, everywhere else, we just are kind of outside that room. We are outside the LP room, we are outside the GP room, we are outside the VC room. We got to get in, right? So that's one. And I think sometimes what we do is, because we're always trying to be nice, and the truth is being nice is always not successful. Being nice is a very, you're really jammed in the middle sometimes being nice, because you're trying to please too many people, and sometimes you got to pick your battles and say, I'm going to win this, or I'm going to build a great company, and I may make some people unhappy, or I may look slightly unpopular in the process, or a little aggressive in the process. But that's something, you have to make personal peace with, because being nice is not really a winning formula, honestly. Middle of the road can get you crushed. And the other sort of thing is, we're also, look, as women, we are always sort of, this conditioning we are carrying because people expect us to do this, or whether it's family responsibilities, whether it is, you know taking it easy, or balancing our sort of work life and our expectations. And these are very personal conversations. There's no right answer, you may pick one over other, but I think that personal clarity is very important. But the truth is, if you want to build a large company, and if you want to build a venture investable company, it's going to need a lot from you. It's going to need a lot of time. It's going to need a lot of your life. And you will have to blend your work and life very, very closely. I think that that Chinese wall between work and life is going to go away. It will all sit in one common pool. And the other thing is, you won't be able to have a lot of priorities. Then you have to super prioritize your life to say, hey, I can build a company and I can raise a child. I don't think you can do a third. And we're all humans, we all have 24 hours a day. So acute prioritization is very important. And if you're not in that stage where this is not what you can commit to, then you should really think about hard, before you raise any money. Because once you raise money, then you're really taking a ticket to the rocket ship. You're really saying, I'm going to work as hard as humanly possible and make sure this goes great. And if you're personally not that place, then venture is not really a great way to go.
Right. Now, even when we participated in some of the discussions with investors and some of the founders, one view which comes across is that for a large part of the VC and angel investors, it is really the person who matters. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter what the gender is. What matters is, does the person understand the problem? Has he or she put an innovative product? Can you scale it? Can they generate revenues? Can they create a company? And this view comes across that it's a very, very gender agnostic thinking that happens, nothing to do. And I've had founders also say that, women founders, some of them say that they have never experienced any difference. But having said that, there is a huge number of women who do face a number of challenges and who come and tell us about the experiences they have, because they feel that there is this whole perception they have to fight. Then there is an actual problem of dealing with the actual challenge of balancing commitments, right? Because whatever said and done, even today, in majority parts of India, women continue to bear a heavier burden when it comes to balancing work and family commitments. So that does take a toll. And to top it all, we have the whole conditioning. We are also internally fighting, I feel, because you have probably been raised in a certain manner and you're trying to break the stereotype. So there's an internal fight. Sometimes there might not be anything, it's probably within, which is making you get intimidated in a room full of men, because in your mind they're judging you. So one is that. The other is then you're asked questions like, in terms of family, are you going to get married anytime soon, are you going to have children? So you literally start feeling that as if your commitment to the venture is getting questioned. So I think these are some of the broad level issues which women face, in terms of, even in terms of looking at funding. And I think there's a common saying that in entrepreneurship, the rules of failure are the same for both men and women, but the rules of success slightly differ. Women entrepreneurs, I feel, need to be more determined and persistent than their male counterparts, as they're not only fighting external but internal battles as well.
That's true. That's absolutely true, Archana. I think, look, I think building a company is hard for anyone, and building a great company is a lot of work. But I think that therefore the middle path doesn't work. It's really, if you want to get to the top, or if you want to sort of really build something that's valuable, it's going to take a lot from you. And sometimes that means, pushing aside some of the things that we've been told are part of, being a good mom, or being a good wife, or being a good woman. I think these are all sort of, personal conversations, and they're difficult conversations because there's no right answer. I mean, nobody wants to sort of come across as unpopular or not being nice, but the truth is, these are calls that must be taken, especially in context of a scalable business. I think that's for sure.
Right. And what do you think investors really look for in when they're deciding on investing? From your experience, what are certain key things which they are really looking at?
So investors, one, of course, every investor has a certain thesis, right? Consumers are very clear thesis emerging in India, SaaS. So every investor has a thesis, and before we go to them, we must know what their thesis is, so that what we kind of try. But most investors are looking for two things. If I was to sort of pick one is, you know great teams. Great teams can build in any market, or at least great teams can do a lot better than average teams. So it's really, I think, the number one criteria. And second is large markets. If the market isn't large enough, then no amount of capital or commitment or teams can really win. And nobody wins against markets. Ultimately, markets are the biggest winners, in our in front of us, and nobody beats those. So what we really sort of looking at, if you put yourself in investor shoes, large spaces, great teams, and an ability to demonstrate success. Sometimes you demonstrate it by building the early traction, sometimes you do it with early revenue, sometimes by building a high quality product, or by solving a problem nobody else. Some form of USP, some moat. This is what, something that you have that nobody else has. And if you're able to demonstrate that, I think it's really exciting. And of course, I think if you're an investor, you're also constantly tracking the market. So as a founder, you build one company, but as an investor, you look at 100 companies, so you have a better vibe of the market. You're also trend spotting, right? So for example, if you were to build an e-commerce company today, that was to compete with Flipkart, I think that time is gone. Unless you have a really big innovation on top of Flipkart and Amazon, then that trend has gone, right? Similarly, there was a trend of building Zohos and Freshworks of the world. that trend has gone too. So I think investors are constantly looking for the next big thing. Therefore, investments also come in waves, right? So fintech is a wave, and SaaS is a wave, and these go into further categories. Neo banking is a wave, and consumer CPG is a wave. But the truth is, investors are constantly looking for what are those areas where markets can be innovated on, and what are those large markets that are unlocking themselves, right? So a lot of large opportunities that we are sitting on today is coming on back of this whole India stack. UPI has happened, COVID has accelerated digital. There is a big aspirational population of half a billion people. What is it that we can build for them today, right? So I think a lot of uh, today's building is for a market that's today. But if you were building a company 7 years ago, then you were building for the first wave of commerce and first wave of adoption. So I think keeping an eye on the macro is also important when building today.
Absolutely. I think the other important, large challenge which comes across is the classic contention between profitability and scale.
Yeah.
At times, to be profitable, the promoter may need to compromise on scale, and on the other hand, to achieve scale, a promoter may need to compromise on profitability. Now, with that, different sector-oriented business factor different elements and approach here. For example, for a brick and mortar based industry, success may only mean pure profitability.
Yeah.
Whereas for a technology based company, and especially consumer facing ones, success is also a semblance of the outreach, and therefore the burn ratio is that much more significant.
Yeah. So look, I think it also depends on the market you are in. So if you look at largely tech-driven markets, tech is a very winner takes all market, right? There can be only be one Google, and there can only be one Microsoft, and there can be only be one Tesla. I mean, there can be others, but these are big challenger positions. So if you're building in a market where you are going to be a winner takes all, then growth is really, really like paramount. I mean, growth is everything. I mean, Amazon is classic, right? Amazon burnt money for the first 20 years of their existence. It's only now that they're talking about profitability, and that too not from the commerce business, but from AWS and every other business that they've set up. So I think it depends on what space you're playing in. I think fintechs had the similar trend, and obviously commerce had a similar trend. These are large land grab opportunities. The winner takes all will continue to play out. But in spaces like consumer, if you're building a consumer brand, or if you're building a brand where you're serving a very niche segment and it's not a land grab, then clearly profitability can be put ahead of it. And the truth is, it also depends on uh, how much capital have you raised. So if you are capital strapped and you don't have $1 billion to burn, then you better be profitable before those $1 billion run out, right? Like, so I think this is almost a quarterly question for all startups, honestly. In depending on their size and their ratios and the amount of ambition they have, and obviously their own internal position. But the truth is, certain segments will need growth at all times, and growth defines them. Like social networks are one of those segments. Nobody really cares if Snapchat is profitable or not, but if Snapchat stops growing, then that's a real big challenge, right? Or but at the same time, if you're building consumer brand like Beardo, or one of the CPG brands on the shelves today, it's all right not to be in a mega growth, because over a period of time you will have a significant market share. Even a 20% market share is good market share there. So I think technology plays slightly differently as a sector. But the truth is, in a good business, you need, I mean, your timing may vary, but you can't build a good business without both, in your plate. So as an entrepreneur, always double click both and see what are the levers of growth in your business. Where will more profitability come from? Even today, at the level of Amazon, they're still double clicking on profitability and getting new cash inflow into the company. So what Jeff Bezos says, your margin is my opportunity, right? So clearly they're still unlocking a lot of that value.
Absolutely. I think one more aspect which we'll cover before we open it for questions for everyone is this, typical question comes from all entrepreneurs that if I've raised a term sheet, then what are the issues typically which are faced by the entrepreneurs as well as investors? What I should bear in mind? So I thought we'll briefly just cover that and then we'll open it up. So to that, I think from an entrepreneur's perspective, there are several aspects. Of course, there are a lot of jargons and difficult terminologies which I'll not take you through right now. But as a concept, I'll tell you all that there are multiple aspects which need to be borne in mind. For example, on certain specific sectors such as financial services or technology based companies, capital plays an extremely significant role. Because in case of financial services companies, capital is raw material. And for high growth technology companies, capital is the most significant form of commodity to be able to scale and grow and penetrate different markets, which in turn results in requirement of more capital and therefore rapid dilution for the promoters. Now, therefore, what becomes important in those is that certain rights like promoter minority protection rights, promoter incentivizations, upside sharings, certain reverse clawbacks need to be looked at, negotiated, and addressed so as to not just protect the skin in the game of the promoter, but also to motivate the promoter to perform and create wealth for all the other stakeholders. And this is something which will be beneficial for the investor's perspective as well. When there is an overall value created for every stakeholder, it directly impacts the return on investment for the investor. So that's something which, as promoters, we should be wary of. Then there are other aspects such as preemptive rights without a mop up in favor of existing investors, so as to not create an impediment for the incoming investor, and other protective covenants such as personal liability protections. So, every investor is going to ask for indemnities from the promoters. It is important that we restrict those indemnities to, as far as possible, to the company, and if they are being sought by from the promoters as well, we restrict it to the shareholding of the promoter and let it extend to the personal liabilities of the promoter. So limitations of liability is something which becomes very, very important as well. From the investor's perspective, for them, exit is holy grail, and it is important that that needs to be taken care and addressed. So, at the end of the day, a deal is a deal when it works for both parties. It's similar to a marriage, and both have to work together to make it really work. So, Sari, your experience has what is your experience on this?
Absolutely. Look, I think when you build a company, you're building it over a period of time, and you will raise money hopefully many times over, especially in this day and age. If you're building a fast growing business, then there are three things you will always be doing. You'll always be raising, you'll always be hiring, and you'll always be selling. So like it's really like the wheels that are always in motion. And I think therefore two things are important. One is just the general hygiene of setting up your systems and processes, which includes compliance and filing and a whole lot of really unsexy work that goes in building a company. And I think you can't build a company without getting that right. And second is of course uh, just the job of making sure you are not curtailing your own growth options. Your growth options may come from your own board structure, for example, or your own rights as a founder on the table, or even things that you're accountable towards. So I think being mindful of your own rights as a founder is important, but your accountability as a founder is an equally important one too.
Right. Pooja, should we open it for questions?
Yeah, I think sounds good. So hi, Sari. Hi, Archana. I mean, it's been so interesting to hear all aspects of investing. I think on the floor today, we have a lot of young people and young entrepreneurs who would like to ask. Maybe may I request all of you to probably either post your questions or maybe just feel free to ask. At the same time, there's something that I wanted to ask is at what is the kind of stake one has to share with the investor at the time of seed funding? When a young investor starts on a company and he's looking for seed fund at that stage, uh, what is the kind of stake that you have to share?
Right. So look, obviously depends on the sector, depends on your valuation, depends on everything else. But look, early investors come in because they're really taking a risk. Their risk is the biggest because your likelihood of sort of not working out is the highest when you're a young company. So early investors will take up what they call risk positions, and they also want to build ownership in the company, and any ownership that should translate into something meaningful, at a point of exit, and they will also get further diluted. So in average, investor will take about 10% at a seed stage. For more better valued company, it'd be even be 5 to 6%. But these days, I'm seeing rounds as low as 3 to 4%. So really depends on what business you're building. But honestly, if you're building a lot of value, uh, the truth is, cap tables over a period of time, they tend to balance out. So even if you've diluted a lot early, and there's a lot more value being created, then entrepreneurs do get sometimes their equity back by the many instruments to make that happen. But the trick is to sort of uh, look, the biggest job when you're sort of raising money is that your investor needs to be really invested in the company. If it's a very small stake, if it's a 1%, it's very easy for them to write off and sort of really not consider you worth helping, after a point in time. And of course, if it's too big, then obviously you don't have enough room and you're sort of diluting too much too early. But my experience has been 6 to 10% in an average company. That's pre-revenue.
Oh,
Right. I
that's
agree. Terry. So
another.
Pooja, it's in that
Yeah.
range. One more thing which you need to bear in mind is the first and foremost step which you need to do is to get a valuation done by a chartered accountant. And of course, there are different methodologies. You have DCF methodology, and where you talk about future projections as well. So you can in your mind, given the business and the sector which you are in, you can have all those parameters lined up, create a valuation which is something which is, you can talk about keeping in mind all of these factors, and then the mathematics works in such a way that depending on what the valuation comes out and the amount which is being sought for is where the shareholding or the stake we're talking about is decided. So that's how it typically works.
So there's another one that's come from someone. It's Derek. He's asking that what is the advisory equity at the seed stage? You know,
Right.
also what's the equity given, to any advisory who just sort of, at the seed stage at various stages, when they enter the entire proposition. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Derek, do you want to mute yourself and ask the question so that we have more perspective?
For sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Fantastic. Hi, I'm a early stage, uh, investor as well. I'm based here in Singapore, and also mentors. I just want to know a couple of things. When you enter as an advisor for startup, uh, generally said, you can negotiate for 1.5 to 2%. So what's the industry standard if you enter at an early stage? And if you enter as an advisor at a stage of Series A or Series B, what is the equity that's standard, so that there is a win-win, for the founder as well, and for the advisor mentor also.
Should I take that?
Yeah, sure, sure. Go ahead.
So look, Derek, I think the part advisory equity is the value of the advisor. You know, so honestly, if the advisor is somebody who can really make a difference to your cap table, to your business, they can open doors, they can open the next round. Then honestly, there is not. It doesn't matter whether it's 1.5 or 3.5, honestly, and different advisors would be valued differently, right? So if I was to get, let's say, Azim Premji on my cap table today, I mean, look, he doesn't need my equity, I need him, right? So I think it depends on who's the advisor. But typically, a 2% is like a norm. You want to give enough, but you still want to respect everybody else who's sort of also on your cap table. So it's a delicate balance, but I think more than the percentage of equity, it's really the value the advisors really bringing to the table. And obviously, as your rounds become bigger, it becomes less than 1% or 1%, or sometimes it's even much smaller, just a couple of percentage points. But at the seed stage, sometimes it's even up to 5%, like I've seen. But really depends on who are these people and what do they bring to the table. And advisory equity is really, something that should be given to people you really value and want to have like a business relationship with for a long time.
Right. And these are typically in the form of mentor equity. And like Sari said, it's about the value they bring in, the kind of intangible benefits. You can calculate the percentage depending on what you see as a value which they are bringing on the table.
So there's another one. Is it what is
Fantastic.
the right
Thank
time
you.
to raise Series A funding?
When your Series A ready, when you have like revenue scale. I think typically in India, Series A is anywhere between $2 to $5 million of revenue, but really depends on who you are and what business are you in. Revenue scalability. Basically, Series A money is all rocket ship money. Like after that, the company should grow, at least 2x every quarter, and that's a good metric for Series A. When you've achieved your product market fit, you're not sort of, you're really ready to scale your business.
Should money be the only key factor, when you raise the revenue? I mean, should revenue be the only key factor when you raise the Series A actually, or should you even look at other aspects, other developments?
Well, I think product market fit is core. Like it's not just revenue; it needs to be sustainable growth revenue. It can't be just any revenue, and of course, it can't be service revenue. It can't be revenue that can't be replicated. So I think that's important. And of course, your own readiness as a business. I think your own readiness as a team. But revenue is a very significant indicator of are you ready to raise your Series A.
Some students here and they want to know, they're actually working on a social startup and they're stuck up with pricing and affordable plans. So at what stage can they subscribe, can they start looking at fundraising?
So there are impact funds who do look at social startups as well. So you can do research around that, depending on what the business of your company is.
Actually, Ankita Verma wants to ask a question, and she's written, what is the size of a typical ESOP pool, and what is the industry standard for offering equity stake to the early core team members?
So typically,
I
it
mean,
is
at the CXO, yeah.
5 to 10% is what the ESOP pool is typically.
Well, I think a lot of students here, and they want to ask a lot of questions. They could probably unmute themselves, and
More
you know,
interesting.
so there's. I'm kind of reading up on what. So all this that I was saying, we are students working on social. I think a lot of questions around social startups. A lot of students who want to know when to ask. So I
Growashri,
think,
you want to unmute yourself and ask?
somebody's
Um,
actually asked, can you describe an ideal startup for an investor to invest?
Hello, ma'am. I'm Manya. So,
Yes,
can you hear me?
yes, we can.
Yeah. So, me and Gruhashri, the one who posted the question, are basically working on a social startup together. Now, we are really confused that how do we attract our investors, looking at the aspect that it is a kind of a social aspect and it's not having so much of a profit. Like it's more of a sex education app which we're talking about. So we don't know how do we go about it because we aren't like commerce students. We don't have a background of that sort. So we're just looking into it.
Sure. Sari, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So look, I think so. A lot of businesses may not have the profitability and scalability that venture would like. There are different ways to fund your business, right? So if you're building a social business, then grants could be one way to go, or impact funds could be another way to go. Crowdfunding could be another way to go. So you really don't always have to fund your business with venture money, especially if you're building something that is still shaping up. You're still working on your pricing, the market is still maybe not as large, or maybe it is, but until you've arrived with a lot of clarity in these things, your fundraising should be what I call alternate channels, and what that will allow you to do is to craft your product well and craft your offering well. Look, there are a lot of things that create a high level of impact, but they will never have the commercial scale of venture. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. And the truth is, investors don't want to subsidize any product, right? Like they don't want to subsidize unless you're going to be the largest, unless you're going to be an Uber and you're talking to SoftBank. These are super exceptions because these are global utility products, right? So unless you're creating something that will replace a very, very large market, let's say you came up with something that replaces petrol tomorrow, right? Like significantly so, then maybe you have a real chance. But if you're building something that is still finding its feet in terms of product market fit, then alternate channels are the best channels at this point in time, because it helps you sort of understand, look, all this capital that you raise has to go back, and it has to go back 10x. So for every 100 rupees you raise, you have to return at least $1,000. So ask yourself, is your business ready to generate that kind of return? And if it's not ready, then look at alternate channels.
Right. And like I said, Manya, you should
5 o'clock.
Who are these impact funds? There are a bunch of impact funds who invest in social enterprises. So it would be good, as like we said, that research on the investor is something which you should do on the side, so that you can start initiating conversations with the relevant investors.
So
Thank you, ma'am.
Sorry, there's one more question on behalf of the students who are actually studying and also planning their entrepreneurial ventures. So how much of commitment does an investor see in a student if he wants to pursue education alongside his venture? Does that become a deterrent, in an investor looking at commitment? You spoke about commitment, Seri, initially. Yeah.
So look, as an investor, one is definitely looking for commitment, but there are a lot of student startups that are getting funded. So I think, in fact, investors love student startups because, there's a lot more agility. I think it depends on your own commitment to sort of like keep building that company, and, but student startups are really, I think, a way forward. I think the earlier you start up and the more you experiment, the better it is.
Pooja, you're on mute.
Sorry, because I see a lot of students who dropped out to be able to pursue their, venture. And then, then they found that little space. They felt that the commitment was lacking. They couldn't look at this entire project simultaneously. So I think that concerns a lot of students here.
Right. So look, I think if you're building a company, then you're building that company. There's no other way about it. Like, this is not a project. There are no grades. There are no marks. You don't do it because somebody told you so. You do it because you want to build a company and you want to solve a problem. Then you do it with all you have, all your time, all your money, all your resources.
Absolutely. And what investors see is the caliber which you have, and they appreciate the fact that being young students, you are thinking about this, and if your idea is something which works, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's very encouraging, I'm sure, for all the students here.
Thank you. I'm sorry, but I have a hard stop. I have another meeting to jump to. But
Yes.
thank you.
Let's put it. So thanks so much, Seri. We had a super time with you and Archana, and you guys, I think, enlightened a whole lot of us here. And I'm sure we'll have lots of food for thought going back. And I think it's very encouraging, at least for students, to understand that they can go out and reach out, and I'm sure sky's the limit. Thanks so much.
If you need help, please reach out and keep building your companies. Go for it.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Seri. Thanks, Pooja. Thanks, Sharmila. And thanks to all our participants, to our partners. Milanmai, Sanjoy is also there, to all the students who've attended, and to the IIT Bombay eCell, and FICCI Flow, of course. Thank you all.